second monitor, so I'll have to just make do with checking those out at the end, I think.
That works.
Okay, guys, we are here for the Ortus Developers Week. This is the second day, second session. So I hope you enjoyed the first one, and this one is gonna be even better. So please follow us on Twitter at Ortus Solutions. And what is ODW? It's a free week-long online conference led by Ortus team and some community members. All sessions will be recorded and you will be able to check at them in our website, ortusolutions.com/ODW, as well as the material and content that we will be using. You will find it there. Why ODW? Because we love training, we love education. This is a developer focused. We like to show new products and roadmaps, our partners. We like to increase community, and we want you guys to adapt to the new technologies as well. So Ortus Solutions is a professional open source. We provide training, support and mentoring plans, architecture and design, web development, and there is always time for entertainment too. So that's why mariachi singing is always included. So if you guys want to help us, you can become an Ortus patron, sponsor our open source development to keep Forgebox.io alive, you know. It is always good to receive some help. We will provide the documentations and downloads online. And this is the schedule. As I mentioned before, this is day number 2, November 7th. We have Nolan's presentation today, who is going to talk about testing non-ColdBox site with TestBox. And you can always go to the website and check for the schedule. And two more important announcements. Next week, we will be having the CF Summit's RESTful Services Bootcamp at Las Vegas on November 14 and 15 at the Mirage Hospitality Suite. That is very nice. So remember that the seating is limited. There is a discount code for you guys. So take advantage of it. And also next year in April 25th to the 27th, we will be hosting the Into the Box 2018 conference here in Houston, Texas. So go and to the links and get your tickets. Okay, Nolan, so I'll be stopping my share screen and you can start.
Okay, let me share my screen. Let's see, desktop. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yep, excellent. Let's see, does that work? Let's go here. Cool, okay. Good afternoon, most people. Good morning for you West Coast folks. My name is Nolan Irk. I run a consulting business called South of Shasta. And today I'm going to talk about how to use TestBox for non-ColdBox CFML websites. Here's the obligatory ego slide, if you will. As I mentioned, I run a consulting business here in Sacramento, California, where we do web development and mobile development and on-site and remote training for different companies. There are some companies that I've taught with and worked with. I've written various programming languages over the years. I run a meetup here in Sacramento called SAC Interactive, where we talk about all things web and mobile related. Sometimes the talks are on CFML, sometimes the talks are on how to build a Unity 3D video game or neat SQL database tricks somebody learned. It kind of varies across the board. Before I got into web, I wrote video games for a few years. And I would be willing to bet I spend more time and money going to concerts and buying vinyl records than anyone watching this webcast. I buy lots of CDs, as you can see there, and I buy lots of vinyl records. I'm quite proud of my record collection. For anyone interested, the slides that I'm going to go over today and all of the code samples are up on my GitHub account. You can just go to that repo after the session is done and grab everything you want from up there. For the demo I've put together for today, I'm using the H2 database that's baked into Lucy. So I think the code as is will have a couple of, let's say 5% of the code is Lucy 5 specific right now. None of the TestBox, none of the testing stuff is Lucy specific. It all runs on Adobe CF and Lucy just fine. It's just for simplicity. I went with the H2 database that was baked in just to make a couple of things on my laptop easier for me. So you can look at all the code if you're on ACF. You might have to change a tiny few things here and there to get it to run on a ColdFusion server though. All right, so today's agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about testing and some misconceptions that go along with testing. Then we're going to talk about TestBox and some of the misconceptions that go along with using TestBox. Then we'll show you how to install and start using TestBox. And I've got a handful of code samples showing an app that has 2 or 3 different, we'll call them methodologies, although you'll see that there's not a whole lot of structure to them. 2 different methodologies in my app for how they were built, neither one of which is ColdBox. And I'll show you how to break that code apart and test it using TestBox. And then I'll point you towards some other resources after we're done so you can look up more information on your own. So everyone knows they should test their code, but where do you start? If you have a great big app that's already been written, that can be kind of overwhelming to figure out where you add testing to that. If you're starting an app from scratch, that's also got its own questions along with it. Do we start with testing the UI? Well, if we haven't written the UI yet, but we have database queries that we're starting with, there's no UI to test, things like that. Do you start with testing by using Selenium scripts? Do you manually grab a coworker down the hall and say, here, click on this screen for a while and let me know what breaks? Does your company even have an official QA team? Are they doing white box or black box QA work? Does your team even know the difference in the two? These are all things that I've run into at different companies over the years. And depending on the size of your company and the budget and how technical the people are financing the project, sometimes it can be a real challenge to find testing resources like physical people either in a QA team to do the testing or even just other coworkers to do the over-the-shoulder test where you have someone in, let's say, finance, click on the screen for a few minutes to see if it works correctly. Those kind of things can be a challenge. So anything we can do to write scriptable tests will just make it easier to make sure we don't break code moving forward. It'll make it easier overall for you to retest different sections of your app rather than having someone yourself maybe even clicking on the same buttons on the screen over and over again, filling in the same form 50 different times, things like that. There are pieces of that that you can script and automate to make retesting the components of your app a little bit easier. So as I mentioned, there are different types of testing. You can test the UI and the UX. You have tools like Selenium that will help you test clicking on things in a form or in a web page and seeing how the different pieces of the web page work, if the UI shows the pieces that it's supposed to show correctly. You've got form submissions. Lots of people still use JavaScript for validation because maybe they're new to development or they just never learned properly that you can turn off all of the client-side validation like JavaScript and submit a form without any of those chunks of code running. Once your form post goes up to the server, you've got a bunch of database queries up there and maybe other business logic that needs to be tested as well. There's lots and lots of different things that need to be taken, that need to be examined and looked at when you're testing your web app. Testing is the QA department's job. Sometimes you'll hear people, hopefully, usually it's junior developers, although I guess it depends on where you work and who you're dealing with. People might think testing is the QA department's job. Why should I, as a developer, spend time writing tests? I should be spending my time fixing bugs or writing new features and adding value to your application. There are stats that show that the sooner you can fix a bug in your project, the less money it costs your company overall. If you fix a bug during the requirements gathering phase or during like early portions of development before you've pushed your public beta out, It takes less time and less money to fix those bugs than it does further down the line. If you only find a bug, once version 7 of your app is out the door, it takes a lot more time and resources and money to fix the bugs at that point than it does if you just caught it early in prototyping and in requirements gathering and things like that. So anything we can do to make quick, reusable tests easy to be part of our application, that's just going to make everyone benefit along the way. We do all benefit from all different types of testing. And no matter how many scripts you write, no matter how many TestBox tests we have, no matter how many Selenium scripts we have, human QA is always beneficial too. There's no way to completely replace like a QA engineer. We're not going to lose anyone's job simply because we have Selenium tests and TestBox tests that we can run by clicking a button. There's still benefits to real people looking at web apps, making sure that the color schemes match the correct branding, and to make sure that the sites are web accessible. You're using accessible fonts and accessible color schemes, and make sure all the business logic pieces make sense to the way they're supposed to, and all kinds of things that can still be benefited from, even if we have lots of tests being automated by a tool like TestBox. Some people feel like writing tests slows us down. It takes too long to write the tests. Again, I should just be writing code that's fixing bugs and adding new features to my app that bring in money. Maybe at first it can be a little bit slow at first to start writing tests. The less object-oriented programming experience you have, the more writing a test might seem a little bit foreign in how you put them together. It is a new discipline. It takes a little bit of time to learn how to do it. I've been writing OO code for quite some time. And even myself, when I get into using a new test framework and set things up, I still will hit a roadblock here and there when I get things going. But once you get over that initial learning curve, it does help everyone. It does make, the time you spend writing your tests will go down the more you do it. You'll just get better at it, just like writing any other sort of code. You won't have the same roadblocks and headaches as you go. It gets easier, and it becomes more like adding a comment to your code or adding similar bits of validation. Like if you have 4 different forms on your site and all 4 of those forms need to have some sort of backend business logic that checks for duplicate entries before the form is saved to the database. When you write the first one, it takes you a little while. But by the time you've written the first 2 or 3, writing that duplicate validation code for the 3rd and 4th sections of your web app goes a little bit smoother than the first one did. Writing tests works the same way too. So it might take a little while at first, but it's not too bad once you get going with it. I need a drink of water real quick. There's different types of testing. Unit testing, where you're testing units of business logic in your app. As I mentioned, you can test the UI and UX. There's integration testing and regression testing and lots of other things. We're not going to cover all of those today. Mostly we're going to focus on testing units of business logic, doing some unit testing with the TestBox framework. And there are lots of other resources and books out there for the other types of testing if you want to look into more of that later on. So what is TestBox? TestBox is a CFML testing framework for automating testing portions of your app. TestBox supports behavior-driven development, and it supports XUnit style testing. Basically, the difference in that is the type of code you write in your test. The BDD style code looks a lot more like the current trends in JavaScript, where you have lots of closures in your code, where you'll have lots of anonymous functions kind of calling each other in a loop in like a jQuery block or an Angular JS block and things like that. Behavior-driven development code looks sort of like that. We'll spend a tiny bit of time looking at some of that today. For today's demos, I wrote most of the code in XUnit style testing simply because it looks less OO centric to me. And I feel like for people that are watching this talk that are maybe not really comfortable with an OO project yet, I thought that might be the better way to go and to make things a little more clear. TestBox is free and open source. You don't have to pay anybody to use it. You can just grab the files off GitHub and drop it on your machine and start testing your app. It works on both Lucy and Adobe ColdFusion. Some TestBox misconceptions out there. It's a testing framework. Framework usually means I have to rewrite my entire app. When I went from my old CF include based app into ColdBox, I had to get rid of all of my CF includes and start using models and controllers and handlers and interceptors and all this stuff. So TestBox must mean I have to rewrite my entire app. That is not true. You can leave all of the code in your app as is. You don't actually have to touch your app. Testing frameworks are not the same as model view controller frameworks or dependency injection frameworks or anything else. The testing framework lives by itself in its own folder, separate from all of the code in your app. As you'll see when we get to the demo, I have a TestBox folder that all my TestBox stuff goes in. I have a tests folder that all my tests will go in, and they're completely separate from the code that actually runs my application. The reason I say your mileage may vary on that is while the testing frameworks, not just TestBox, but any of the others too, MXUnit or whatever else, they're all great. You can leave your code as is, but the worse your code is, the harder it is to test everything. So if you do have, just for worst case example, a really, really old Cold Fusion app from 1998 with lots of CF includes that have maybe 4,000 and 5,000 lines of code all in one CF include template, and you've got a bunch of those in your app, there are not really easy ways to test those sorts of things. So the better your code is, the easier it will be to test. But as you'll see when we get into this, you don't actually have to have a full-blown OO app to test anything. And you don't have to change any of your framework code in your app, whatever you have either too. Another misconception, it's a box thing. So that must mean it requires ColdBox, right? That is also not correct. You notice when I get to the code that I'll have a TestBox folder, which is its own self-contained thing. You will not see the word ColdBox anywhere in my directory structure when we go take a look at that. If you are using ColdBox, TestBox does come with that, so you don't have to download a separate thing if you want to start writing tests in your ColdBox ecosphere. You can just start doing that. But if you're not on that, if you're on Framework 1 or an old CF Include app or some sort of homegrown framework, you can still benefit from TestBox, and that's what we're going to look at mostly today. For the purposes of the demos, I'm not using Framework 1, I'm not using ColdBox, I'm not using any MVC framework at all. I'm going to use code that looks pretty much like what I think a scaled down version of some homegrown apps out there would look like. So we can see hopefully how to use that on most web apps out there. Another misconception is people might think, oh, this is super hard to install and configure. There's probably an XML file I have to edit, or there's some sort of TestBox config CFC that I have to set a bunch of things in. Maybe I have to make some sort of TestBox JSON config file and install a node package or something along those lines. Nope, you don't have to do any of that to start using it either. The easiest way to start using TestBox, install CommandBox. That works for Windows, Mac, and Linux. It takes 10 seconds. Once you get CommandBox installed, you type box install TestBox. Your machine will spin around for about 7 or 8 seconds, depending on how fast your internet connection is. Boom, you're done. You now have a TestBox folder in with your project, and you're all set. That's all you have to do. If my app is older, we're not using object-oriented programming. This won't work for us. That is also not true. You don't have to be using CFCs. You can be on CF includes still from 1999. You can be using custom tags or CF functions. As long as your code is written with some level of organization and modularity, the fact that you're not using components won't matter. And I'll show you how to do that when we get into the demo of the app. And again, though, the more modular and encapsulated your code is, the better. So again, like if you have an old CF include that's 3,000 lines of code, that's going to be harder to test. But if you can break that up into maybe 7 or 8 smaller CF includes, maybe 2 of them that handle your database stuff, maybe one that handles your business your error validation, another one that draws your UI on the screen or something like that, that'll make it a little bit easier to benefit from TestBox, but you don't have to use components. You don't even have to use frameworks. Okay, so I've installed TestBox. Now what? Now you start testing. You pick a folder on your web app somewhere where you're developing your project and write some test CFCs. There's a thing called a test runner that comes with TestBox. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. And you use the test runner to tell TestBox, this is the folder where all of my test CFCs live. Please run those and start checking different chunks of my code. So how do you write a test? The details on how you write a test varies depending on what your app does. If I have an app that is maybe a finance application that deals with people, redoing the loan for their house, well, then I probably have big chunks of logic in my app that do things like check interest rates and check a person's background credit and see which loans they qualify for, see how many payments maybe they've been late on in the past, or whatever the different bits of logic are in your app. The point is the business logic is specific to that application. So there's no magic set of tests I can put on GitHub right now and say, run these tests, they'll work for all of your apps out there. This is where the work actually comes into play. If you've never written a test before, you probably cannot throw this at your brand new college intern that just started 2 days ago if they don't know anything about how your app actually runs. You need to have somebody that understands what the rules are in your app that can write the valid business logic or give you the ideas on the business logic so you know what the proper tests are for that app. And we'll see a couple small examples of tests in just a minute here. So demo time. I'm going to go back here to Sublime. Actually, I'll open my browser window first. So here's my app that we're going to test today. Here's my pop culture app. As I mentioned, I'm a big music junkie. We have a list of famous movies. We have a list of famous drummers. And we have a list of some excellent new wave bands I recommend checking out if you have the time and iTunes available somewhere. So if I click on a band, it's a standard web app with like a list page. If I click on one of these movies, it'll show me the detail view of that where I can see the title of the movie and I can set the rating to whatever else. And these are all going into my H2 database baked inside Lucy. And again, you can do this with MySQL or Oracle or whatever else you want. I just did H2 for simplicity. There's my favorite movies. That page works the same way. The save buttons do work. If I set that to be Top Gun 2, you can see it changes it to Top Gun 2. I'll set that back the other way. And then the rating works as well. And New Wave Bands looks exactly the same too. If I click on that, I can change the genre that the band is in and go on from there. So there's my app. It doesn't do a whole lot visually, kind of by design. Here's the code for my app. I'm going to make this code window bigger so we can see everything a little more easily there. You can see I have a header and footer custom tag that's just including Bootstrap and drawing my navigation at the top of the site. My home page. Welcome to Pop Culture App 1.0. Looks like that. Here's the code for that entire web page. I'm including the custom tag and drawing some text on the screen. You'll notice here's the folder for my app. My TestBox stuff is right down here. And then I've got some resources for the slides that we've been looking at. And here's a little bit of more info about the database and my tests that I'm going to run later. You'll notice that there's no ColdBox folder in there anywhere. There's no trickery happening here. I don't have a hidden virtual folder pointing to some other spot on my laptop. Literally, I did not install ColdBox ever to set this up. I installed command box, typed install TestBox, and boom, we were done. That created this folder down here with all of my TestBox stuff in it. We'll examine some of that in just a little bit. And then the rest of this pop culture app is just my regular app that was written completely separate from TestBox. I made 0 changes to this app because of TestBox. It just is a plain Jane, intentionally older looking web app with nothing else happening there. So let's take a look at the first page in our app, List Movies. Take a look at the code in there. So List Movies looks like what I suspect a lot of people probably have in some of their maybe older web apps out there. You've got a CF include at the top that goes up to include some sort of movies.cfm file. And then let's take a look at that and see what it does. Include movies. That's got a few different CF functions in it. Get all movies, so it does a select star from the movies table. I've got a get movies detail function that gets me back one specific movie. I have a save movie function that takes the 3 different arguments in, and it does an update to that record in the database. And then it just gets a fresh copy of that movie that we looked at and hands it back so I can take a look at what is actually saved in the database as I go. Let's go back here. So I get that query back and get all movies, save it to a variable, loop over the results, and that draws my list of movies on the screen. If I click on the movie details page, that looks like so. Similar kind of thing, I'm doing a CF include for my movies CFM file at the top. And this time I'm using the get movie details CF function. I'm going to grab the URL for the movie ID that was clicked on, save that to a query, and then just I have a form on the screen doing a pretty standard detail view of whatever was clicked on. When the user submits that form up to the server, it's going to save movie.cfm, which looks like this. I'm including that same CFM file. and I'm calling save movie and just passing it the movie ID, title, and rating to save that movie into the database. And that's running the update that we mentioned a minute ago right here. And then it just returns a fresh copy back to whatever chunk of code happened to be calling that, in case I want to look at what the latest version of the movie looks like after it's saved, redirect myself back to the list movies page. Pretty standard, not the oldest, worst architecture I've seen in a web app out there, but there's no components in here. There's no ColdBox, there's no Framework 1, there's no FuseBox even. It's just .cfm files with a little bit of organization to them. Let's take a look at the next one over. So I've got movies, here's drummers. List drummers.cfm is going to look basically the same way. Include a drummers file, and that looks the same. I've got a get all drummers that does select star, get drummer details, which gets me back one specific drummer record, save drummer, which does the update and then returns a fresh copy back to the calling chunk of code as well. There's nothing else below that. And then I've got a drummer details page that works the exact same way as the movies one does. You point to a save drummer page, and it does the same thing. I have a save drummer function, and it goes in there and does a couple of things in there. So here's my web app. Nothing terribly exciting about it. The code is broken up into reasonable chunks of modularity, though. You notice I don't have one long .cfm file with the database queries in it, and the form posting code, and rendering everything on the screen. I've got things broken up into 3 different chunks. I have kind of a view section of my page where I just, here's code that basically is just drawing the contents on the web page that you view. I've got a save movie, where'd it go? I've got a save movie CFM file that just takes that information and says, okay, I received some form variables, save those to the database, and then redirect the user back to the home page. So this is sort of like a controller. It's controlling what happens after the user filled in the form. And then my save movie stuff is often a model folder in my movies.cfm file here. And that's doing all of my database and business logic type things. We'll get to the new wave bands one in just a second. So here's my TestBox folder. That's what got installed when I did box install TestBox. I have not changed anything inside here. This is all exactly how it comes when you install TestBox on the machine. And if I go to that URL, here's my directory structure with everything in it. If I go click on TestBox, you can see in here there are various things, some of which you'll need to play with, some of which won't matter too much. One of them in here we have is this test runner. And I click on test runner, and it gives me this baked in screen here I can use to actually run the tests in my app. So we'll come back and play with this in just a minute. Now I'm going to switch back over to the code and show you the other folder that I created, which is this my tests folder up here. I've got 4 different types of tests inside there. I'll start with this first one, my first test. When you write your tests in TestBox, this is what they look like. You make a component. You can give it a display name. You don't have to. This is optional, but it helps just to make it easy to tell on the screen which test you're running. I mentioned that there are BDD style tests, behavior-driven development, and there are XUnit style tests. This is an XUnit style test. And all that really means is you have a bunch of functions in here. Notice how this function is called test something. There are a couple of naming conventions that come into play when you make an XUnit style test. The functions themselves that run your tests, they'll all begin with the word test. You say test something, test login page, test logout page, whatever. They begin with the word test. And that's how TestBox knows which functions in this file are the ones that are going to run your tests. There's also a function called setup. And again, that's a reserved word inside the TestBox tests. This is going to run before any of my tests run. So if I need to initialize variables before anything happens to certain values, setup will run first. In this case, you can see I'm setting favorite color to green. Then my tests actually run. It's going to output some debug information for me to the screen, check things in here. So in here, I could do something like assert that variables.favorite color is equal to green. And that should check that this statement here is true. I've actually been having better luck putting a double set of parentheses around them. I'm not sure why, but actually to make sure that that's true. So that's the thing I'm testing. And if that's true, that is true, this will run as part of my test. And when I output it to the screen, you'll see how everything works. And then I have a teardown function afterward. So setup runs before my tests run, teardown runs after all the tests have finished running. So not a whole lot of things actually happening here in this test, but we can see how it runs back here in our test runner. So that's in my folder number 1. Let's go back over here. My tests, folder 1, and I'll run that. And you can see here's my tests. It outputs the name of my test. You can see that one test I have passed, no failures, no errors, nothing was skipped. My first test X unit style, that is the text from our display name right here in the code. So you can see where that came out from. Oh, and of course we also extended the TestBox base spec. That's what makes all the magic work together here in our test, is doing that. So there's our test. I can see that it ran. Nothing terribly interesting happened. It outputted our debug information up there, but there's our first test. So let's go take a look at the second one. This is what the BDD style tests look like. You have a function called run, and instead of having individual tests like this guy, or individual functions rather, like so, with just function and then different names of your tests, you have this other syntax where you say describe the name of the test, and then before all your tests run, you have something that you want to have run before that test. And then there's other functions that kind of go on with this sort of plain English sort of style naming convention. They say describe this test before each test, do these different things here. And then there's functions like it should, and then you tell it what kind of things do. And it's got a little bit more of a storyline looking feel to how it's written. But you end up with this sort of, it's their closures, but you end up with this sort of syntax going inside itself really quickly, really several levels down. But I felt like just doesn't make it as easy to follow what tests do if you're brand new to writing tests. So I went with this kind of example instead. But you can do BDD tests, and there are several good presentations from Luis online. You can grab slides from one of his talks. I'll point you to the title of that and some information in a little bit to see what to do from there. So here we have real tests for my real web app. Let me close down my other files just to get them out of the way. So you can see my folder 3, I have a drummer tests CFC, and I have a movie tests CFC. We'll start with the movies one since we began with that. Same thing as before, display name, and it extends that TestBox base spec file. I have my setup function in here. I have a couple of tests inside it, 2, and I have a teardown function afterward. If you remember back in our code for the app itself, here's my pop culture app, we have a data source named mytestdsn2. That's the same data source I'm setting up here in my setup function inside this test. That way my tests, since they are in their own folder, outside of this application CFC's domain, this is how we get the application variables to be the same for my tests. You just make a copy of them in your stuff here. Just like we do an include in our app to, like for the list movies page, I do a CF include over to the include movies file. I see a couple of you guys chatting in the chat window. I'm sorry, I only have one screen right now and I can't see what the chats are. I'll open that up as soon as we get to the end and answer questions then, sorry. So here in my setup, I'm including that inc movies file, and that just makes the functions in there available to my test, just like they're available in my listmovies.cfm file in the app itself. And then I have my tests here, test updating movie database entries, testing only valid ratings get used, and my teardown. So let's take a look at this first test. I'm just going to call that save movie function inside my CF include, pass it some values, whoops, and make sure that those tests actually run the way I expect them to run. Make sure it's going to save movie number 2. It's going to set the title of that to test movie, change the rating to R, and then I have these assert functions inside here where I can say, is it true that my database, that the database record we got back is movie ID now equal to true? I can also check, is the title in fact now set to test movie? Did the rating in fact get changed to R? And if all of these work correctly, I'll get status updates on the screen when I run that in my test runner saying, yes, these are true, or no, these tests failed for some reason. Then I also have this test that only valid ratings get used. You can see here I'm trying to use that same save movie function, but instead of passing in PG or G or PG-13, I'm passing in FF. There is not a rating called FF, so that should fail. That will give us an idea that we have maybe some business logic in our code that we want to change. And you can see I have an assert here checking to make sure, okay, is this database record that I got back, is the rating going to be equal to PG? We're not passing PG in here, so this is probably going to fail, and we're going to have to, that'll be an indicator that we need to set something in our app. Let's go take, and then of course I have my teardown that just when these tests are done writing, if I have changed any database values to something else, it's just going to call save movie again directly and set it back to a valid entry. As you can see here, when I go back to list movies, movie number 2 is Sneakers, and it currently has a rating of PG. Now let's go to our test runner. I'm going to go into that folder and run my tests, and you can see down here are my movie tests. One of them passed, and one of them failed. So down here in green, I can see test updating movie DB entries is green. That test ran correctly. That was this one right here. So saving entries into the database works. I know that my update SQL statement doesn't have any typos in it. It's not doing anything strange that it should not be doing. The values I passed in are in fact the values that my test says, yes, those are correct. That's doing what we want it to do. But this other test only valid ratings getting used, that test failed. We can go down here and take a look at it, expected false to be true. Let's see if we can expand that out and take a little bit of a look at some of the details we got in there. You can see you get a whole stack trace of what happened in your code, in your test. And I can tell that my movie tests, line 25, let's take a look at that. Movie tests, line 25, there's the assert that failed. You can say, oh, okay, this is the part that failed in my test. I was expecting it to be PG and it's not. Well, let's go take a look at our save movie function and see if we can tell what's going on in there. Somehow, when I was monkeying around with this file yesterday or the previous week, or maybe some other developer was in here, they accidentally commented out my validation code that says take a list of all the valid movie ratings, and if we didn't get a valid movie rating passed in, default the movie to PG. So since this code got accidentally turned off, that's what's causing my test over here to fail. I was expecting PG and that's not what I got. So let's go back here into our save movie code. And again, this is in our actual web app itself, not a test. And let's uncomment that code, or maybe more accurately in a real app, maybe you actually have to write this code and put the business rule in place that says, yes, this is what I want to have my application do. So now our movie code is in there and working correctly. I go back here and run my tests again. You can see, ignore that one for now, that's the drummer test, we'll get to that in a second. Now you can see my movie tests, both of them are passed. 2 passes, no failures. My movie code is now a little bit more sound and robust than it was previously. And now I know that if I come in here and make other changes to my save movie code later on, I have movie tests in place that will check all that stuff and make sure it's working. And you'll notice even though I am saving the movie as Pink Panther and trying to set it to an invalid value, when this code runs, that should update movie number 2 to be Pink Panther, giving it a rating of PG, since we have that new business logic in our app. But because we have this teardown function at the bottom too, as soon as these tests are all done running, my teardown runs afterwards. So the test cleans up its own mess, and it will actually set movie number 2 back to the legit value of Sneakers PG-13 when it's done. So you can change things in your tests and set them back the way you want afterward in your teardown function. Let's take a look at the drummers test. Similar kind of thing, let's go back to our app. Here's our list of drummers. You click on the drummer, you get the detail page. And you can see I've got years of experience for the test, for the drummer. If my app will currently let me do things like set it to a negative value like that. I want to make sure that my business logic in the database doesn't actually allow for that to happen. So if I go in here and look at my drummer tests, you can see I have 2 tests just like before. I've got my setup, initializing the variables and making some functions from our app available to us. I've got a test that's going to check to make sure my update code works correctly, just like the one that we wrote in our movie portion of the app. Check to make sure that the values that I passed in did in fact get saved in the database correctly. And then I've got this other test I wrote that says test no negative numbers, no negative years experience. So here I'm going to try to save Ringo Starr and say that he has negative 99 years of experience. It's going to try to run that update in the app. Well, let's take a look at the current version of our save drummer code. It looks like so. I don't see any validation in here right now that's going to prevent me from giving somebody a negative number of years of experience, which of course makes no sense. Let's go ahead and run our tests. And you can see, of course, one test is failing, and it's that test, testing no negative numbers experience. Line 21 is the part that has that code on it, saying, oh, okay, that, we were expecting something different than what we got. I set it to 99. What I wanted to have happen was anytime someone uses a negative number, just default it to 0 years of experience, and we'll deal with, they probably didn't mean to type -5. They probably meant to type something else. So let's just set it to 0 now, and that'll make the data at least legitimate, if not correct. We can say 0 experience, the person's not a drummer, or they're brand new to drumming, or whatever we want to do that way. So now I have an idea that something's wrong in my code. I can go back to the business logic in my application, and I can add in a few lines of code to say, okay, now I know how to make my app a little bit more robust. Let's put some validation code in here. If they type in a negative number, just default it to 0. And now when I go back and I run my tests, you can see both portions of my app have all green tests passing now, and everything works the way you expect it to. So those two portions of the app were built using the same decent, if not kind of dated architecture. We've got some CF includes, but everything inside there is CF functions. So you've got these nice little reusable functions that take arguments in, return data back. They all kind of work about the same way. It's not, sexy ColdBox 5 with all the plugins and everything, but it's a decent way to modularize your app if you have nothing else or you're not familiar with how to do stuff. Some applications out there are even a little bit more long in the tooth, shall we say, than that. Let's take a look at our New Wave Bands page, list New Wave Bands. And that page in the app is this one. So we're just listing out the synth pop bands up there. Same thing as before, I'm including a file. Here's my header and footer, and I'm looping over the records in the query. You'll notice in this one, I'm not calling a function like we had get all movies or get all drummers. There's nothing like that happening here. Well, let's take a look inside that CF include and see what we have in this file that's different. So you'll notice in this CF include, there are no CF functions anywhere. It all looks probably a lot like older Cold Fusion apps maybe we used to start writing when we were first brand new to programming, or if you have a legacy app you still have to maintain, maybe somebody else wrote code similar to this, and you're kind of stuck patching and fixing it as you go. You can see we have 3 CF queries in here with this great big if-else if statement. So we have like if the user did a form post, then we're going to do the update and save the new values from the form into the database. If we got passed in a URL band ID, then we're going to draw that one specific band on the screen for later use. And if we didn't get either a form or a URL variable, we're just doing a select star, give me every band that is marked as new wave, and draw them all on the page in that query QRY new wave bands. And you can see that's what we're looping over here on our loop page. If I click on the band details page, you can see it's going to stick a band ID in the URL. And band details looks the exact same way. There's no function up here, get band details or anything like that. We're just doing a CF include. And that CF include has this if-else if logic baked in where it says, oh, okay, now I got past a URL band ID. I need to run this specific query instead where I get the one record back and go from there. And then, of course, if I click on a band, click on Duran, band details does a form post up to the save band.cfm file. And that looks similar to the ones that we had before. You'll notice though in like our save drummer file, we had this function we're calling in the middle of it though, where we pass the form fields into that function, and then we do a redirect back to the list page afterward. Here in the New Wave Bands one, that function call is missing. We're doing the CF include, and then we're doing the location afterward. So this code's a little bit less clear. It's not as easy to tell what's going on. It's a little bit of an older style app. But now that we've walked through the code, we can tell, oh yeah, there's this first check of our if statement. If we get a form.band ID passed in, that means we're doing the save band update from the form post, take these form fields and save them to the database, and then redirect back to the calling page when we're done. So none of that is what I would call super modular or super well organized. It's pretty dated looking code. It's not things that I like to work on very much, but I'll be honest, I have 1 or 2 clients that are still kind of set up this way, and every once in a while they call and say, hey, can you come fix a bug in our site? As much as I would like to delete all of the code and rebuild it with a nice MVC framework and all proper modern web development tasks, that's just not realistic for those guys. So we have to find ways to work with CF includes and older apps like this and still be able to test them. You can actually do some of that. Here I have another folder with my new wave band tests in it. You can see I have a setup function just like we had before, where I just make the data source available to my tests so I can run database queries. I have a teardown function that's a little bit different than what we used in the last one, but we'll come back to that in just a minute. And I have two tests in the middle here. I'm going to test making sure that getting the band details works correctly. And I'm just doing a CF include to that same inc newwavebands.cfm file from my app. And I'm just setting the URL variable to a specific band ID that I know is in there ahead of time. And I can use those same assert functions in here to make sure that the tests are grabbing the records that I expect, and those should all run the way I expect them to. I've also got a second test here that's going to test saving changes to the band. Remember, in the include file, we're checking for a form posted band ID. And then if we got that, we're going to do the CF query update. And we're just going to grab all three of the fields we need out of the form scope. We can do the same thing here with variables right inside our test. Just make 3 form variables, set them to the values you want, do the CF include afterward, and that will cause the form post section of our if statement to run, this guy right there. Then once we're done with that, I just remove that band ID from the form scope and set a URL band ID to number 3, which is the same ID we used before. And what that will do is now we're going to skip the form post section of our if-else if statement and run the URL band details section instead. And then I can do a CF include a second time. That's what will cause the band details part to work. And I can do my asserts now and say, okay, now that we got back a band details query from that line of code there, I can test to make sure, did my update work correctly? The update I set up here with 5 or 6 lines of code, depending on how you want to count it. Did that in fact do an update the way I expect it to? And I'll do the same asserts there. And then of course, when I'm done, I can basically use that same sort of update syntax where we make fake form variables and set the band number 3 back to whatever the original values are in your app there. If I go back here into my TestBox runner and switch over to folder number 4, where my new wave band tests are at, you can see both of those tests run. I got 2 passes, getting the band details worked correctly, saving the changes to the band worked correctly as well. Everything looks good. And again, notice no ColdBox, no node secrets, no MVC frameworks. I've got my TestBox folder down here. I've got my folder with my tests in it, and I just go into the test runner and tell it, go to my folder, my tests, /3 for the drummer and movie tests we did, /4 is where I put the new wave band tests, just to break them up. In a real app, you'd probably put everything in a my tests folder. You'd have maybe a whole bunch of .cfc files in there with, you could have hundreds of different tests by the time you get around to writing them all in there. And that's it. You don't have to have any ColdBox. You don't have to have any extra magic. Yes, technically we're using CFCs here, but other than this first line of code where you say component and then extend the thing, everything from then on is just straight functions that you call. You don't have to do any more object trickery if you're not comfortable with that. Other good resources for learning more about this stuff, the TestBox book and the Ortus website are great. Also on the Ortus website is a copy of the slide deck from Luis's talk, Automate Thyself, that he gave at CF Objective. I sat in the front row of that. It was great. It opened opened me up to a lot of ideas on tests and other things I had not looked at very in depth at that point. And of course, they're all on Slack and Google Groups, and there's the great Into the Box conference next year. You can learn about more stuff from them. I happily block off time for clients to just kick around ideas and help give advice on projects if you want to hire me to do that sort of thing. Validate This isn't really a TestBox project, but it's a ColdFusion project out there that makes it really easy to add self-documented validation rules to your app in a very nice, reusable, readable fashion. So I would recommend checking that out if you have a few minutes. And if you're brand new to tests like I was, check out Ben Nadell's blog post, writing my first unit test with MXUnit and ColdFusion. He's not using TestBox because this entry is from a little further back in time. I'm not sure if TestBox was out when he wrote it or not, but you can look at the code example of the first unit test he wrote, and it's a really good plain example of how to start doing that sort of thing. And then once you get your tests working, you can look at tools like Jenkins for automating those tests. So maybe every time you check new code into your GitHub repository, your tests automatically run. You don't have to manually go in here to a browser and open a window and click run. You can just have Jenkins automatically do that for you behind the scenes. Where'd my code go? I'll go back there. And then, of course, Selenium is great, too, for automating web browser testing when you get to that point. That's worth checking out as well. And with that, I have 5 minutes left for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, or if I can figure out a way to get the chat window to pop up, I'll do that as well. Chat window.